Hello everyone, and welcome to part 10 in this series on modeling and texture painting in Blender. And in this part we're going to start working on the blade of the axe. And even though we initially blocked out this color to form a sort of a base for the lighting and shadow, I think I'm going to start from scratch with just one single color. So I'll enable my masking and then just select the blade. And then I'll go to my fill tool, and with the S key I'll sample this middle color here. And I'll go ahead and fill that whole axe blade with that one color. And the reason that I'm doing this is because I don't want that initial color blocking that we added to define the shape of the blade, because those hard edges of shadow and light they showed the geometry. So now instead we're going to paint on the detail so that we can essentially give it whatever shape we want. Okay, so now I'll just line up my UV image editor and the viewport so that I can paint in both. Although I think for the most part I'll just be painting in the viewport. But I always like to set up the UV image editor too, just in case I want to move over and do some small detail. But the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to add a gradient to this blade. And you need to be still in fill, but I'm just going to come down and check the little box that says use gradient. And the colors are black and white, which is fine. So you see if I drag the line up now, it creates that gradient. But I want to switch the blend type to color burn. And now if I set the strength to about a 0.5, and now if I drag this line up, it will just basically just add that dark value in. Okay, so that looks pretty good. And now we can switch back to the draw brush. And I'm going to choose the white color. And I'm going to choose this second brush here, which is kind of a harder brush. You know, we used it before for some things. It's not too hard of an edge. It still has a little bit of a soft faded edge to it, but it's a lot harder than the other brushes we were using. And we're using the blend type of overlay, and the reason we're doing that is again because it takes into consideration the darker parts, so it takes into consideration the lighting and the shadow. But all I'm going to do is just trace around the whole edge of the axe blade. And this is supposed to represent like a, you know, the sharpened edge of the blade. Okay. So now I want to clean up the little areas around where those little cutouts in the blade are. So we need to switch to the smear brush, and we'll go to this fourth tab, which is the soft brush. And I'm just going to drag in where these little cutouts are to form little peaks there, because it's just a little too rounded around those areas. I want them to take on the same shape as the blade, so we can just smudge in that line so that it comes to a point. And then also, if you wish to, you can lower your brush strength and just drag some of this black in through the edge of the blade and keep it relatively small, and that way you can again just paint in a little bit of detail to make it look like there are smaller chips in that blade. I'm just going to undo that with Control Z because I'm going to keep it relatively simple, but you know, that's always an option if you plan on spending a little more time painting the blade. And now for the detail on the surface. In the last one we added a texture that we downloaded. In this one we're going to go back to the texture tab, make sure that you're on brush and click new. And this time, instead of image or movie, we're going to use clouds, which is a procedural texture. And down here under the basis type, we're going to switch it from Blender Original to Voronoi Crackle. And so now if we come up, okay, so we have to do this again because we were still in the smear brush. So we're back to draw brush, we'll click new, change this to clouds, Voronoi Crackle. Okay, so now if we paint this on the surface of the blade, it shows up, but it's backwards because we actually want the cracks to be white and the spaces in between to be darker. So all that we need to do is click on this little drop down color box and then click ramp and then this double-sided arrow which will invert the colors. Okay, now that looks alright, but I want it to be a little bigger, so I'm going to Control Z to undo that and then raise my brush size with the F key. And yeah, I'll paint this one much larger and that looks better. I'll just go over it a few times. Okay, and now that we've added the base of that texture down, we can start adding a little bit of detail. So I'm going to come over to my brush and add a little bit of green to it. It's still very light, but just a hint of green. And I'm using the blend type overlay still. And I'll take the strength down pretty far, like a 0.25. And now I'll come over to my UV image editor and I'll lower my brush size with the F key. And I'm just going to start scratching some of that color in, but it's not drawing for some reason. Oh, of course, we still have the texture applied, so we'll just X that out and now we can draw it on. And I'll come to this, make sure that you're on that soft brush. And maybe I'll take the strength up a little bit to maybe like a 0.5. Okay, that's a little better. So I'm just like we did with the edge scratches when we were painting on the metal. Just, kind of scratching the color back and forth as I follow these lines down. And this will make those, because I think that these are supposed to appear to be raised hard edges. So, so basically the lighter green that we're scratching it around it is sort of the gentle slope from that hard edge down to the lower surface, if that makes any sense. And then after we do this, we'll add a little bit of lighting and shadow to make the to make it look like it's taking the shape of the of little concave grooves. Okay, so almost done here, and then we can start painting in some of the soft shadows. So I'm going to start by selecting sort of a dark purple color. Nothing too dark, maybe the value just below the midpoint. And I'm going to take the brush size up a little. And I'm just going to paint a little bit of this dark purple into these little individual shapes left by that procedural texture. And the reason that I'm doing it is because I was sort of contemplating on how I would make this, because this is a gemstone, it's an emerald, which, gemstones aren't transparent, but there is a degree of clarity to them where you should be able to see a little refraction and some of the background coming through. And the best way that I can figure to do that is by adding a little bit of separate colors into some of the shadowed areas, and that might help it to appear that some of the background is coming through. So what I'm doing is I'm painting along the top of each one of these individual shapes, again left by that Voronoi Crackle, and that's supposed to be a little shadow because the directional light's coming down, and because each of these little shapes is like a tiny little cave, they're concave. There would be a little shelf of shadow at the top, and on the bottom there will be a little shelf of light. So again, just like accenting a little bit of shadow along the tops of each one of these shapes. And the reason that I chose purple is because it's a complementary color to green. When you look at the color wheel, whatever color is opposite of the color that you're using is its complementary color. So orange is the complementary color to blue, purple is the complementary color to green, and so on. But yeah, I just experimented also with a little bit of color, and I just found that purple looked the best when adding it in. But it's also very subtle. I mean, when you look at it, you don't immediately think purple. It's just a good accent color to help bring some of that detail in. Okay, now I'll change my brush color to a very light blue. It's almost white with just a little hint of blue. And I'll start painting in the light. And just like we did with the shadows, we painted those along the top. Now we're going to paint the light along the bottoms of each of these individual little shapes left by the procedural texture. But these up here along the top of the edge of the blade will just be filled with light because there's nothing to cast a shadow on them. Whereas, these down here in the middle have this groove along the top which casts the shadow. And really, I mean, this is all, based on the idea that the directional light is coming from above, but if it was coming in from like a particular angle, like a diagonal angle, you would want to, adjust how you're painting the light and the shadow, of course. And down here on the bottom, I'm just going to paint a little bit of lighter color through it because I want to keep it mostly dark. We added that gradient in, and I don't really want to take too much away from it. So now I'm going to work on these little chipped areas in the blade. I'll use the S key to sample a green from the surface of the blade that we painted. And I'm just going to fill it in to this little area. And I'm using the mask tool, of course, because I only want to paint in that area. And now I'll switch the color to white, and I'm still using the overlay blend type, and I'll just draw a little edge around the border of it so that it looks like that edge scratch continues into the little chip through the blade. And of course, just do the same thing here. Just randomly select any one of the greens so that it's a little darker, because I think the initial color was very light. You just paint some of that in, and then we will select white and then draw that edge scratch around it. And then finally one more. This one I'm just going to paint the edge scratch around because it's okay that it's light inside of that one because it's kind of facing that directional light. So it would probably be a little lighter than the other two. All right, I think I'm going to take a second and just go ahead and save my texture now. I recently lost a little bit of work when I was working on a separate project. So now I'm pretty careful to save as often as I can. So now I'm going to switch my blend type to color, and I'm going to select this purplish color with a little bit lighter of a value. And I'll take the strength of the brush down pretty low and select this soft brush. And so what I want to do now is just use this to paint over top of the whole surface of the blade to sort of desaturate it a little and introduce a few different tones. So just to show you what I mean, if I just use the masking tool and then select the blade so I can paint just on that, I can increase the brush size really large and just very lightly go over the whole surface. And it just sort of draws some of the green out and introduces a little more of that purple. And I'm not necessarily being too consistent. I'm actually purposefully trying to add more in certain areas than in others. Just because you have the nature of it being in like a naturally occurring thing in nature, like a gemstone. I'm trying to give it as much randomness as possible. And I can even highlight a little bit of these shadows with that color too, just because they'll stand out the most in the darker areas. Okay, and I think the last thing that I want to do is maybe make it look as though there's light coming from within the emerald. So I'll select this yellowish green color, and I'll take my blend type back to overlay, and I'll increase my brush size with the F key, and I'll just lightly tap some of that color in, and I'm going to do it in layers, so it'll start by just appearing to be very light, and then as I go towards the center, I'll increase my pen pressure so that it looks like the light's coming from the source where it's the brightest, and then as it expands out, it's a little duller. So I'll really go heavy right here on the middle of it. Okay, so I think that's it, guys. I think we're done this one, and we probably only have one more part to do by adding some of the final details in. Maybe two more parts, but we'll see. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.